Hello, everyone. We are back for another edition of AP Human Geography, our online lectures. Tonight we have the first lecture of our newest unit. This unit is on culture. Now, the culture unit is split up several different ways. Our textbook does some different things with this. It splits it up into four major chapters. Those chapters are folk and popular culture, language, religion, and ethnicity. And then built into that, we talk about gender and identity and different things like that. But starting tonight, we are beginning chapter number 4, which is folk and popular culture. But before we even talk about the difference between that, we have to understand what is culture. And so for that, we're actually going to be bouncing around different parts of our textbook. And so here we go. To start us out, we have to define what culture itself is. Now, I know many of you already have in your head, you know what you think of when you think of culture, but just some background, some basics. The word culture itself comes from a Latin word, cultus, which means to care for. So our definition that we will use in this class, and as always with our definitions, and you're going to see lots of definitions tonight because it's the first lecture from this unit. It's the intro, so we have to kind of lay the groundwork. Remember, we are underlining important parts of our definition. Culture, the body of customary beliefs, social forms, and material traits that together, when brought all together, constitute a group's distinct tradition. So, when we talk about what culture is, again, we're going to go back to that Latin root, to care for. And so there's a couple different ways that people care about elements. Okay, so first off, what people care about, a lot of times things like language, religion, ethnicity are really important elements that people care about that define their culture, and that's typically what we think of when we think of culture. But in addition to that, we're going to kind of break out of the box for a minute and talk about what people take care of, and more specifically, how people take care of things. Because that's really going to define for us, especially next lecture when we talk about the difference between folk and popular culture, a lot of these different elements and how people take care of things. And so that's going to be really interesting because we're going to notice some differences between MDCs and LDCs in the way that they take care of things. For example, I'll throw this one out here. We'll talk about next lecture shelter, housing, and the difference between folk culture and popular culture. Now, to be clear, folk and popular culture don't perfectly align with MDCs and LDCs, but let's think about this for a second. In folk culture, shelter is really about protection. It's about protecting oneself from the elements. And that's what people care about, is making sure that there are four walls, there's a roof, that they're protected from the elements. That's the biggest thing. Whereas with popular culture, it tends to be a little bit more about the style. Now, obviously, the four walls and the roof and all that kind of stuff is still important, but is that what you think of when you're going out to look for a new house, when you're going out and buying that first house? Or is the thing that is a primary concern for you the fact that it has four walls and a roof? Probably not. That's something that tends to be taken for granted in popular culture areas like in MDCs. Instead, it's more about the style. How big is it? What does it look like? What amenities does it have? Does it have a fireplace? How many bedrooms does it have? Does it have a pool? Things like that. And so the way that people take care of different elements of day-to-day life, like food, like clothing, like shelter, will vary from place to place. And a lot of times it varies with folk culture and popular culture. So let's first start out by defining, we looked at culture, now let's look at where culture is being practiced. So here we go. A culture region is a region defined by similar culture traits and cultural landscape features. Now, a couple of those different terms that are in there. Culture trait, we're going to define here in just a couple minutes. Cultural landscape features is not going to be next lecture, but the lecture after that, our third and final lecture for this particular section of the culture unit. But in order to evaluate a culture region, we have a model that we can use. And it's not so much a model like the demographic transition model, like that. It's really more of a model in kind of the Ravenstein mold of things. It's something that you need to know. It's not necessarily something that I don't anticipate like very specific questions like you might get with the demographic transition model. But all the same, let's run through it, make sure that we understand the elements of it, and it's fairly intuitive in the way that it's set up. So here it is. This is the core domain sphere model. And you can see the abstract model down below and then a more specific example there to the bottom right. The core, another one of our vocab terms, is defined as the zone of greatest concentration or homogeneity of the culture traits that characterize a region. So when we're looking at those culture traits and those cultural landscape features, the core is where it's going to be most concentrated and most homogeneous. The domain is going to be outside of the core, in which the culture is still dominant but less intense. All right, maybe it's not as homogeneous, maybe it's not as clustered. And then finally, the sphere, the zone of outer influence for a culture or region, where it still might be, fairly dominant and things like that, but maybe not, again, as homogeneous. So if you take a look in the bottom right, first off, let's ask the question, what type of map are we looking at here? And at what scale? And you'll notice that this is a choropleth map at the subnational scale, specifically the state scale within the United States of America, and it's centered on the west, where we see the region of greatest dominance for the Mormon faith. And so if you take a look at this, and I know it's kind of a small image and it's even smaller on your notes, but if you take a look at this, you can see that small strip of red that's right there, right around Salt Lake City. That's where we're going to see the greatest concentration, the most homogeneity of the Mormon faith. And then the brown, that's the domain. The yellow, that's the sphere. And so we can see that extending into parts of southern Nevada, most of Utah. There is part of either the core or domain, and if it's not part of the domain, it's certainly part of the sphere. And when we take a look at this in our religion chapter, we're gonna see this in greater detail. All right, so what makes up culture? So we're gonna walk through this. I know in your notes that you can see all the different elements, but let's kind of walk through this together. First thing is that an action has to be repeated many different times. We call that a habit, a repetitive act performed by, and this is important, a particular individual. So just a habit by itself doesn't necessarily define a culture, but it's the first step towards this. When many people continue a habit to the point where it becomes characteristic of them, we call that a custom. The frequent repetition of an act to the extent that it becomes characteristic of a group of people performing the act. And in fact, we can take that a step further and we can say that customs are actually what we call culture traits, which we mentioned on the last slide with regards to the core domain sphere model. And a culture trait is just a defining characteristic. On the last slide, it was followers of the Mormon faith, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And it doesn't matter what it is. A good example of a culture trait, it doesn't, in this case, not necessarily religion, but talking about a folk culture group, the Amish, largely clustered on the East Coast, particularly in Pennsylvania and Kentucky. We see, some fairly strong pockets in like Wisconsin, parts of Minnesota, things like that. And one of the defining folk culture traits of the Amish is that very traditional lifestyle, not using electronics and things like that. In fact, TV shows have kind of taken this folk culture trait and turned it into something of a popular culture element by creating TV shows like Breaking Amish, where young Amish individuals, as part of their folk culture tradition, where they go out and experience life outside of the Amish community, um, where they videotape that and turn that into a TV show. And there have been several different examples of that. But like one folk culture trait that's fairly well known, uh, that's associated with the Amish, is the use of horse and buggy and very traditional uh, elements of what we might call old fashioned, but is just traditional Amish lifestyle. And that's an example of a folk culture trait, is just a defining characteristic, a custom, something that has been frequently repeated by a group of people, so much so that it becomes characteristic of them. Now, when we combine all the customs and traits that exist, we get a comprehensive view of a group of people. Now, this creates what we call a culture complex. And so this is defined as a related set of traits, so multiple traits together, which may be as basic as things like food preparation, serving, and consumption, or as intricate as religious beliefs and business practices. So essentially what this is a single folk culture trait, such as not eating pork, is a singular culture trait that is a custom of a particular group of people, and there's several different groups that don't eat pork. But then when you combine that with other elements that might be associated with food preparation and other food culture traits, together those become culture complexes associated with, in this case, food. Now, when we combine all of those different culture complexes, that's when we get culture. So to create like a little visual hierarchy of this, it starts out with a habit, a single person repeating something. When a group of people continue repeating it, it becomes a custom, something that is associated with them. Then that custom becomes associated with a culture complex. That culture complex, combined with all the other culture complexes, become what we define as culture. All right, so let's break down culture even further. There's two major branches here that we could talk about when it comes to what is culture. And we're going to use that same definition that we were just using, the body of customary beliefs, social forms, and material traits, in order to break that down. So when we talk about the customary beliefs and social forms of a particular group of people, we're talking about non-material culture. Defined as the beliefs, practices, and values of a group of people. Should be noted that non-material culture it's non-material. You can't hold it. You can't touch it. But it's there. And we can make the case that it's much more enduring, as we're going to see with a later definition. All right? And I'll explain why here in just a couple minutes. So there's two major parts of this, and those are the customary beliefs and social forms, but two different definitions to correspond with this. Metafacts are central and enduring elements of a culture expressing its values and beliefs, including language, religion, folklore, artistic traditions, and the like. Metafacts tend to be the things that we think of when we think of culture. When somebody says, I want to travel the world and experience different cultures, a lot of times what they're thinking of is, different languages, different religions, different ways of life, and those are really metafacts, really central and enduring elements of a culture. Sociofacts are those social forms that we mentioned up above. Here's the definition. A rule, custom, or institution that links individuals and groups as part of a culture, including family structure, political, educational, and religious institutions. Now, sociofacts, a good example of sociofacts would be, if you've ever heard someone say about a society that it's matriarchal or patriarchal, those are good examples of referring to sociofacts, because it's talking about how the whether it's power, whether it's the descent of goods or the inheritance of goods or heirlooms and things like that are passed down. You're talking about the social forms, how society is structured. And matriarchal is traced down through a woman's side or the mother's side, whereas patriarchal traced down through the man's side or the father's side. And so that's how the society is structured. And the recognition of, whether it's respecting one's elders, those are things like sociofacts, because it's how the society is structured. And again, you can't touch that. You can't hold it. But is it important? Of course it is. Now let's flip to the other side, material facts, material culture. The physical items produced and used by members of a specific culture group and reflective of their traditions, lifestyles, and technologies. And an additional definition that corresponds with material culture are artifacts, a material manifestation of culture, including tools, housing, systems of land use, clothing, and the like. This is the stuff you can see. This is the stuff you can touch. Now, here's a good example. Manifacts are the religion, whether that is Christianity or Islam. Artifacts are the physical manifestation of that. The Bible, the cross, the Quran. Those are the physical, material aspects of culture. And they work all together. But when I mentioned earlier that the menefacts and the sociofacts tend to be more enduring, here's what I meant. If there's a natural disaster, if there's an earthquake, if there's a flood, the artifacts might get destroyed. Buildings destroyed, people lose their family heirlooms and things like that. But is the language destroyed? Are the histories that people know, are the religions destroyed? Or can those carry on? That's what we mean when we say that they're enduring. They're able to carry on even if something like that were to happen. So let's take a look at a couple different examples of this. Again, on the left-hand side, we've got non-material culture. And what I would like you to do on this particular side is I want you to add some additional examples. What else could fall under these categories? On non-material, we've got language and religion, ethnicity. Those are the 3 other chapters of this culture unit, by the way, from our textbook. Values, beliefs. What else falls under non-material culture? Give me some examples. I want to see a couple examples. And then on the flip side, material culture, buildings, tools, clothing, art, music, food. Those are the things we can see, that we can touch, we can hold. What else could fall under that? I want to see some examples here. And if you need some help, we're gonna use some visuals here. All right, so this is the first of a couple different visuals that we have. Now, this is very, very, very small. So you may want to go to the website and pull up this slide, and then you can enlarge it and work with it a little bit more. But all these different elements go into what is culture. And so if you're struggling with some different examples, this might be a way to help provide some additional examples. All these different things, whether it's things like politics and values and economics and technology, social organization, all these different types of things are elements that go into culture. Notice there at the top, they have the environment. That's important too. And so all these different things go into building one's culture. And these by themselves might be culture traits or customs. They might be, when taken in like a single box, all those social organization traits, that might be a culture complex. But then when you add in social organization with modes of expression, all these different things together, coming together, what do you have? You've got culture. So that's what we've got. And so hopefully these visuals help with sealing that. I really like this one because I think it helps with what we've got. So this is the cultural iceberg, and whoever created this was a genius. It's great. And if you've ever seen the movie Titanic, sorry, spoiler alert, the boat sinks. But you know that most of the iceberg is actually below the surface. And that's what this culture image is all about. Is that, yeah, on the surface, a lot of the stuff that we can see, what's that surface culture going to be? Things that we can see, things that we can touch, we can hold, versus the deep culture, the stuff that we can't necessarily see, but we know is incredibly important in making up what is culture. So which one is material, which one's non-material? And then take a look at all the different things. And again, I know the font's really, really small on this image. So again, go to the website, pull up this slide on this PowerPoint, on the culture intro PowerPoint, and take a look at this. Because these are some good examples to help solidify what culture is. All right, shifting gears a little bit. Where does culture come from? This is a really good question. We've got a couple different maps here that we can use. So first off, we have to define a particular term, that is culture hearth or cultural hearth, where it's the origin of a major culture. And so in this particular slide, it's looking at some of our major culture hearths, okay, where very early culture began. Now, what I would like to point out right now is what we pointed out a few months ago when we talked about the early origins of the Industrial Revolution and predating that and all that kind of stuff. These areas, these culture hearths, are also the places where agriculture began. And so these are the hearths of agriculture and urbanization. And we also saw the origins of culture as well. And as the year goes on, we're gonna tie all of this together. But please make a note right now when you're looking at this image and the next image that these are the origins of culture, agriculture, and urbanization. We're going to explain why that is as time goes on. But maybe for right now, use some of that critical thing. Go, well, why? Why would the places where culture begins be the same place that agriculture begins? Be the same places people start clustering in cities? How are those linked? Why might they have all started in the same spots? And you can see those spots there. Why do you think that is? Think about that. Now, I told you guys before, back in unit number 1, that we would see this image again, and here it is. Right? These are some of our cultural hearths and the diffusion routes. Notice here we've got a choropleth map. We've got national scale, because we can see boundaries of countries. Should be noted that this is also a goods interrupted Homolysin projection. And what I really like, and please make a note in your notes. It'll be black and white in your notes, but notice the different shades of culture. The darkest green are the ancient hearths, which are the hearths that we just looked at on the last slide. Then the lighter green are the spheres of interaction, okay? And then the diffusion of that from those areas, how it diffused to these other areas. But then finally, notice the modern hearths. That's the gold, the yellow. And so notice where they are. We've got Eastern North America as well as Western North America. We've got Western Europe. We've got Japan. Those are the areas where modern culture begins. And what might be another name for modern culture? And hopefully you said popular culture, because these are the hearths of popular culture. So please make that note. If you didn't write it down, please do, because that's going to be super, super important as we go into our next lecture. Now, it is also important bringing back some elements of this, and you're going to see several of these questions in your practice test on the test coming up. And the reality is you can see a lot of these different elements, and I wouldn't be surprised to see a few questions on the AP exam, hey, when you guys get there, okay, of how culture diffuses, how things diffuse, and you have to know the different types of diffusion. So, real quick, remember these different types of diffusion. And so I'm going to take a moment, I'm going to ask you guys, define these in your own words, very, very briefly in your notes. Take a moment, press pause, define these very, very quickly. All right, just keywords, keep it short, make sure that you understand what these are. All right, but contagious diffusion, what is contagious diffusion? What is hierarchical diffusion? What is stimulus diffusion? Notice that those are all three together under the umbrella of expansion diffusion. And then we have our other branch, which is relocation diffusion. So take a moment, define all of those. It's good practice, it's good review, because you're going to see a lot of different elements of that as we go through this chapter. All right, we saw this back in unit number 1, and it bears repeating because we're talking again about diffusion. So we have to talk about things like distance decay. Again, distance decay, as you get further away from a particular area, interaction is going to decrease. Now that we're done with migration, we can tie this back to the gravity model. So gravity model and distance decay together linked. As distance increases, interaction decreases. That is a negative correlation. All right. But because of space-time compression, that isn't always the way that it is. And because of new forms of technology, communication, and transportation, that's what we're talking about here. Communication, transportation. We're seeing elements of this diffuse globally so much faster. And that leads to globalization. So here's our definition again. This goes back to unit number 1, expansion of economic, political, and cultural processes to the point that they become global in scale and impact. Now, we're going to modify that in this unit with this new term called glocalization. Now, take a moment, notice what changed here. We got globalization, we got glocalization. What's the difference? What do we do with this? So take a look at this. Glocalization, the adaptation of globalized products to local tastes and contexts. And McDonald's is an amazing example of this. Because McDonald's modifies their menu and modifies what they do to reach the people in a particular community. And so even though they are a global company, they are globalized. Over 100 countries have McDonald's. You'll see the golden arches just about everywhere. But the menu's a little bit different. And local tastes and local preferences are something that McDonald's pays attention to. And we're going to see that in class. So I want you to keep that in mind as we go forward. Now, we could use another example of this with the internet, because the internet does a lot of different things for us. The internet can spread an idea very, very quickly. This is contagious diffusion. You can put a video up on YouTube of, I don't know, maybe awesome geography lectures, and then you're still interacting with people, but now you're not interacting face to face, but it's still contagious. You're still spreading information through contact. And so an example, as it applies to our units here, is with language. Because language is something, as we will see next chapter, English is spreading as a global lingua franca, which is a language that is used to communicate with people that don't necessarily speak the same native language. So someone who speaks Hindi as their first language and someone who speaks German as their first language might be able to communicate using English. Right? But, and when we take a look at the internet during our language unit, we'll talk about the language of the internet. And we're seeing that much more and more, it's becoming driven by English. And so the use of the internet spreads English as a lingua franca, a language that's used. And so indigenous groups might start to disappear as a result of that, because people are going to start to learn English in order to communicate with others and might lose that native language. However, the internet also provides a forum for people who might be a little bit more marginalized. So those indigenous groups that have their just a small following who speak that native language might start a Facebook group, might start a website, so that people who speak that language and people who are interested in that language can learn it and can hear it and can teach it to one another. And so that helps to protect it. And so there's a lot of different elements of how this can be used to expand something, but also protect other elements of it. It's really, really fascinating. But as cultures interact, we're going to see some culture change. So these are the last definitions of tonight, and then we'll break it down. But I have to stress that especially two of these, acculturation and assimilation, very, very challenging for students to differentiate. And if I were an AP test writer, I would absolutely put this on the test every single year. Because I would want to see, do the kids actually know the difference between acculturation and assimilation? Because they're two different things. And so we're gonna define them here. I'll give you a little clue that a former student gave me, how she remembered it. And then we'll take a look at a visual. All right? So here are our definitions. Acculturation. Cultural modification or change that results when one culture, group, or individuals adopts certain customs. Underline adopts certain customs. Underline it. Of a dominant or host society, cultural development or change through borrowing, also known as cultural appropriation. Now, we underline adopts certain customs. I had a student a few years ago who told me that the way that she remembered the difference between acculturation and assimilation was ACC. Take a look at that definition. Adopts certain customs. They're only adopting certain elements. They're not adopting everything. They're adopting some things. So we're seeing a blending of cultures. Not so much that it creates a new one, but they're taking certain things. They're borrowing certain elements of it. Just certain customs. Acculturation, ACC, adopts certain customs. Assimilation, process by which a minority population reduces or loses completely its identifying cultural characteristic and blends into the host society. Now, here's where things get kind of tricky, because in this particular definition, it says blends. We just said above that acculturation was blending. Do you see why students get confused with this? It's tricky. But assimilation means erasing. They're losing that old culture, and they're taking on all of the customs. Not certain customs, all of the customs. They lose everything that differentiated them. They lose completely their identifying cultural characteristics. It's erased. It's gone. They take it on the new one. Okay? Multiculturalism, having to do with multiple or many cultures having more than one. Interesting example of this, I had a friend growing up that at school, joked with us, spoke English, but when he went home, he spoke entirely Tagalog, which is a language widely spoken in the Philippines, and that exclusively what he spoke at home. And so there was a different culture between at school and at home. It was really kind of fascinating to see. And then finally, last one, syncretism. And I like sync. They are syncing. They're joining together. The blending of traits from two different cultures, there's that term blending again, from two different cultures to form a new trait. That's the important part, form a new trait. Let's take a look at this. I found this from another AP Human Geo teacher, and whoever created this is a genius. Because this is what it is. Okay? Take a look. Acculturation, you're combining the blue and the yellow together. This person has adopted certain customs. The head is blue, the body is yellow. I assume it's a person. It could just be the letter I. I just realized that. Anyway, assimilation, they're taking on entirely the yellow. There's no more blue. It's gone. It's been lost completely. And then blue and yellow, you join them together, what do you get? You get green. You get a new culture trait, syncretism. And then, to use multiculturalism, it would be blue at school, yellow at home. Or vice versa, whatever it might be. All right? Okay, different cultures together. And we're going to see this in the next unit. We're going to look at very specific examples. We're going to get very real. This was a really vocab-heavy lecture, I know. Next one, we're going to see a lot of real-life activities. It's going to be a lot of fun. I'll see you next time. Have a good night, everybody.